The taste of blood had become as familiar as morning coffee. I pressed my fingertips against my split lip, feeling the tender flesh that would soon bloom into another purple badge of my marriage. In the fractured mirror of our bathroom, a stranger stared back at me, hollow-eyed, broken, wearing the fingerprint bruises of a man who once promised to cherish me. But that morning was different. That morning, I had made a decision that would either save my life or end it. My name is Nellie, and I'm speaking to you from my peaceful home in Savannah, Georgia, where Spanish moss drapes the oak trees like ancient prayers and the ocean whispers stories of redemption. I'm 76 years old now, and for over 50 years, I've carried a secret that nearly destroyed me before it set me free. This is the story of how I learned that sometimes the people meant to protect us are the very ones orchestrating our destruction. The nightmare began in 1949 in a town called Oak Ridge, Kentucky, where secrets traveled faster than creek water and everyone knew your shame before you did. I was born into a world where my father, Joseph Carter, existed only as a name carved into my birth certificate and a bitter story my mother told whenever she needed to justify her cruelty. He went out for cigarettes when you were 2, Dorothy would say, her voice sharp as broken glass. Cigarettes in another country, if you ask me. Left us both to starve. But even as a child, I sensed something wrong with that story. The way her eyes would dart away when she spoke of him, the way she'd grip her coffee cup until her knuckles turned white. There were pieces missing from the puzzle of my father's disappearance, pieces that would remain hidden for decades. Dorothy Carter. My mother was a woman forged in bitterness and tempered by disappointment. She worked as a laundress, her hands permanently stained by other people's dirt, her back bent from years of scrubbing clothes that would never be clean enough. But it was her words that left the deepest stains, words that soaked into my soul like acid. Look at you, she'd sneer, watching me struggle with my homework at our kitchen table. Just like your father. Worthless. You think you're special, but you're nothing but a burden I carry. Our house was a testament to poverty, one room divided by a threadbare sheet that served as a wall between sleeping and living. There was no privacy, no peace, no escape from her constant surveillance and criticism. I learned to make myself invisible, to swallow my words, to move through our tiny space like a ghost. When I was 8, I asked her why she never spoke kindly about my father. Because kind words are for people who deserve them, she replied, not looking up from her mending. Your father was a monster, Nellie. A man who hurt people who loved him. And you? She finally met my eyes, and I saw something cold and calculating there. You have his eyes, his stubborn chin. Sometimes I look at you and see him staring back. That was the first time I understood that my mother's hatred wasn't just about abandonment. It was about something deeper, something that had twisted her love into something sharp and poisonous. The years crawled by like wounded animals. I excelled in school, desperate for any approval I couldn't find at home. My teachers praised my writing, my careful attention to detail, my quiet intelligence. But when I brought home perfect grades, Dorothy would barely glance at them. Don't get too proud, she'd warn. Smart girls end up alone. Men don't like women who think they're better than them. When I was 16, I overheard her talking to Mrs. Henderson from the grocery store. They were discussing me, my future, my prospects for marriage. She's pretty enough, Mrs. Henderson said. Quiet. Good worker. Some man will snatch her up. That's what I'm afraid of, Dorothy replied. She's too much like her father. Draws trouble like honey draws flies. I didn't understand then what she meant. I thought she was protecting me from heartbreak, from the kind of abandonment she'd experienced. I couldn't have imagined that she was actually planning something far worse. At 17, I was working at Henderson's grocery store after school, stocking shelves and running the register. The work was simple but satisfying. I loved the order of it, the way everything had its place, the brief interactions with customers who treated me with basic human kindness. It was on a cold December afternoon that Arnold Wilson first walked into the store. He was tall, and broad-shouldered, with dark hair slicked back and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He wore a suit that marked him as someone important, someone who belonged to the world beyond our small town. "Pack of lucky strikes," he said, his voice smooth and confident. While I rang up his purchase, he studied me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "You're new here," he said, though it wasn't a question. "No, sir, I've worked here for 2 years." I kept my eyes down, counting his change carefully. "I meant new to me." He smiled, and it transformed his face completely. "I'm Arnold Wilson. I work at City Hall." "Nellie Carter," I whispered, my face burning with embarrassment. "Pretty name for a pretty girl." He took his change and cigarettes, but instead of leaving, he lingered. "How old are you, Nellie?"
17.
"Old enough to know your own mind, then." He pulled out a business card and placed it on the counter. "If you ever need anything at all, you come find me." After he left, I stared at the card, Arnold Wilson, Public Works Department, City Hall. The paper felt expensive between my fingers, important. No one had ever given me a business card before. The next day, he returned. And the day after that. Always buying something small, always finding excuses to talk to me. He asked about my school, my family, my dreams for the future. I told him, little afraid that if he knew the truth about my life, he'd lose interest. "You're different from other girls," he said one afternoon, leaning against the counter. "Quieter, more thoughtful." I liked that. I had never been told I was special, never been made to feel like my quiet nature was a virtue rather than a flaw. When Arnold looked at me, I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Desire, yes, but also something that looked like genuine affection. "You deserve better than this," he said, gesturing around the small store. "Better than stocking shelves and counting pennies. A girl like you should be taken care of, treated like a princess." Princess. The word lodged in my chest like a warm stone. I, who had been treated like a servant in my own home, was a princess in someone's eyes. Our courtship began in earnest after that. Arnold would meet me after work, walking me partway home, always careful to maintain a respectful distance. He told me about his work at City Hall, about the important projects he was involved in, about his plans for the future. "This town is growing," he said one evening as we sat on the church steps. "Development coming in from Louisville. Smart people are going to make good money. People like me." "People like us," I asked, daring to hope. "If you'll have me." He took my hand, his fingers warm and strong. "I'm not a man who makes decisions lightly, Nellie. But I know what I want. I want you." When I told my mother about Arnold's interest, I expected her usual negativity, her warnings about men and their intentions. Instead, she grew very quiet, studying me with those calculating eyes. "Arnold Wilson," she said slowly, "from City Hall. You know him." "I know of him. He's older than you." "He's successful, educated. He treats me with respect." Something flickered across her face, an expression I couldn't read. "Respect," she repeated. "That's important in a man." Over the following weeks, I noticed subtle changes in my mother's behavior. She would ask about Arnold's visits, about our conversations about his plans. She seemed almost pleased. It was so unusual that I began to hope our relationship might actually improve. Then one evening, she made an announcement that stunned me. "He came to see me," she said, not looking up from her sewing. "Asked for your hand properly. Said he'd take care of you. Take care of both of us." I stared at her. "He spoke to you. When?" "Yesterday, while you were at work. Nice man. Polite. He understands the importance of family." "What did you tell him?" For the first time in years, my mother smiled. Not the bitter, cruel smile I was used to, but something that almost looked genuine. I told him yes, of course. "It's a good match, Nellie. Better than you deserve, if I'm being honest." That night, I lay awake wondering why Arnold hadn't mentioned speaking to my mother. But I was so intoxicated by the possibility of escape, of love, of a future beyond our cramped house, that I pushed the questions aside. Arnold proposed on a warm spring evening in 1968, kneeling in the town square under the old oak tree. The ring was simple but beautiful, and when he slipped it onto my finger, I felt like I was finally stepping into the life I was meant to live. "I love you, Nellie," he said, his dark eyes serious. "I promise to take care of you always, to protect you, to give you everything you've never had." The wedding was planned for 3 months later. It would be simple: a borrowed dress, a handful of guests, a reception in the church hall. But it would be mine, a celebration of my liberation from years of neglect and emotional abuse. On my wedding day, I looked at myself in the cracked mirror of our bathroom and barely recognized the woman staring back. The white dress, though second-hand, transformed me. My hair, carefully styled by Mrs. Henderson, framed my face softly. For the first time in my life, I felt beautiful. "You look nice," my mother said, her voice strangely flat. "He's lucky to get you." It was the closest thing to a compliment I'd ever received from her. The ceremony was simple, but moving. Arnold looked handsome in his navy suit, and when he said his vows, his voice was strong and sure. When the pastor pronounced us husband and wife, I felt like I was being reborn. But the first crack in my fairy tale appeared immediately after the reception. Instead of driving to the house Arnold had mentioned, he pulled up in front of my childhood home. "Surprise, princess," he said, his smile never wavering. "I renovated your mother's place. Made it bigger, better. We're going to live here." My heart sank. "Here, but you said we'd have our own place." "And we do. This is our place now." "But your mother's getting older, Nellie. She needs family around, and family takes care of family." I wanted to protest, to demand the house he'd promised, the fresh start I'd dreamed of. But I was trapped by my own upbringing, by years of being told not to make waves, not to ask for too much. The house did look different. Fresh paint, new furniture, even a telephone in the kitchen. But it was still the same building, where I'd spent 17 years walking on eggshells, still the same rooms, where I'd learned to make myself invisible. "Welcome home," my mother said, embracing Arnold warmly before giving me a brief awkward hug. "I'm so happy we're going to be a real family." That first night, lying in what Arnold called our room, really just my old sleeping space with a proper wall instead of a hanging sheet, I tried to convince myself that everything would be fine. Arnold was loving, attentive, passionate. He called me his princess and made me feel cherished. But as I drifted off to sleep in his arms, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The way my mother had looked at us during dinner, the way Arnold had seemed so comfortable in a house he'd supposedly just renovated, the way they talked about family like it was some kind of conspiracy. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was looking for problems where none existed. But in the days that followed, small things began to bother me. Arnold seemed to know his way around the house too well, knew where things were kept, knew the quirks of the old plumbing and electrical systems. When I mentioned it to him, he just smiled. "I spent a lot of time here during the renovations, princess. Had to make sure everything was perfect for you." The first month of marriage was like a honeymoon. Arnold was attentive and romantic, bringing me flowers and small gifts. He'd take me for drives through the countryside, pointing out houses and saying, "Someday we'll have a place like that." But gradually, subtly, things began to change. Arnold started making small comments about my appearance, my behavior, my choices. "That dress is a little tight, don't you think?" he'd say. "You don't want people getting the wrong idea about my wife." "Maybe you shouldn't be so friendly with the customers at the store," he'd suggest. "A married woman needs to be more careful about how she presents herself." At first, I thought he was just being protective. But the comments became more frequent, more critical. And slowly, I began to modify my behavior to avoid them. 3 months after our wedding, Arnold made a decision that would change everything. "You don't need to work anymore," he announced one evening at dinner. "I make enough to support us both. My wife shouldn't have to work." "But I like my job," I protested. "I like the people, the routine. And I like having my wife at home where she belongs." His voice was firm, final. "We're going to start a family soon. You'll have plenty to keep you busy." I looked at my mother, expecting some support, some understanding, but she just nodded approvingly. A woman's place is with her family, she said. Arnold's right. Without my job, without the daily interaction with customers and coworkers, I became isolated. My world shrank to the confines of our house, with Arnold controlling every aspect of my day. He decided what I wore, what I cooked, who I could talk to. Princesses don't need to worry about such things, he'd say when I tried to make decisions for myself. That's what princes are for. But I was beginning to understand that in Arnold's kingdom, princesses were just prettier prisoners. The first time Arnold hit me was on a humid August evening 6 months after our wedding. He'd come home from work in a foul mood, complaining about his boss, about the heat, about the dinner I'd prepared. "This chicken is dry," he said, pushing his plate away. "How am I supposed to eat this?" "I'm sorry," I said, jumping up to get him something else. "I can make you a sandwich or—" "Sit down," he commanded. "I'm not finished." I sat back down, my heart beginning to race. Something in his tone and his posture warned me that danger was approaching. "Do you know what I do all day, Nellie?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. "I work. I provide for this family. I deal with idiots and incompetents so that you can sit here in comfort. The least you can do is have a decent meal waiting for me." "It won't happen again," I whispered. "No," he agreed. "It won't." The slap came so fast, I didn't see it coming. The sound echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot, and I tasted blood where my teeth cut my lip. For a moment, I couldn't process what had happened. My husband, my prince, had hit me. I looked at my mother, who was sitting in her chair by the window, calmly reading her newspaper. She hadn't even looked up. "Don't stare at me like that," Arnold said, his voice still calm. "You brought this on yourself. If you'd been a better wife, a more careful wife, this wouldn't have happened." That night, I lay awake beside him, listening to his peaceful breathing, trying to understand what had changed. But it hadn't been a change, I realized. It had been a revelation. The mask had slipped, and I'd seen the real Arnold Wilson underneath. The next morning, he was apologetic, bringing me flowers and speaking softly about how sorry he was, how he'd never meant to hurt me, how it would never happen again. "I had a terrible day at work," he explained. "The pressure got to me. But that's no excuse. I love you, Nellie. You're my princess. I'd never do anything to hurt you." I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. The alternative, that I'd married a man who would hurt me, was too terrible to contemplate. But it did happen again. And again. What started as isolated incidents became a pattern, then a routine. Arnold would come home angry about something, work, money, the weather, and I would become his outlet for that anger. The violence escalated gradually. First slaps, then punches, then beatings that left me unable to move for days. And through it all, my mother watched with the same cold detachment she'd shown that first night. "You must have done something to upset him," she'd say when I'd try to talk to her about it. "Men don't hit women for no reason." "I made dinner a few minutes late," I'd protest. "That's not a reason to—" "It is, if your husband says it is." Her voice was final, brooking no argument. "Marriage is about learning to please your husband. You're still learning." A year into our marriage, Arnold lost his job at City Hall. The official reason was budget cuts, but the whispers around town told a different story. Missing funds, inappropriate behavior, complaints that had been ignored for too long. Without his job, Arnold's drinking increased. He'd always enjoyed a beer or two after work, but now he was drinking from morning until night, his moods becoming more unpredictable, more violent. "It's your fault," he'd slur, waving his bottle at me. "Bad luck follows you around like a stray dog. Ever since I married you, everything's gone wrong." The beatings became savage. Not just slaps now, but punches that left me gasping, kicks that cracked ribs, violence that went far beyond discipline or correction. I was no longer his princess. I was his prisoner, his punching bag, his outlet for every disappointment and frustration. My mother not only failed to intervene, but seemed to take pleasure in my suffering. She'd watch from her chair as Arnold raged, sometimes even offering suggestions. She's been acting proud lately, she'd say. Needs to be reminded of her place. 2 years into my marriage, I tried to escape. I'd managed to save a small amount of money from the grocery shopping, hiding coins and bills in an old coffee can under my side of the bed. One morning, while Arnold was passed out from drinking and my mother was at the market, I gathered my few possessions and headed for the door. But my mother was waiting for me on the front porch, her arms crossed her face, set in that familiar expression of cold disapproval. Going somewhere, she asked. I can't do this anymore, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I can't live like this. And where exactly do you think you'll go? She asked. What do you think you'll do? You have no money, no job, no skills. You're a married woman with a reputation to think about. I'll find something. Anything is better than this. She stepped closer, and I saw something in her eyes that made me step back. You think you're special, don't you? Think you're better than this life, better than me? Well, let me tell you something, little girl. This is exactly the life you deserve. This is exactly what you're worth. Why, I asked, tears streaming down my face. Why do you hate me so much? Because you're his, she said simply. Because every time I look at you, I see his face. And after what he did to me, after what he took from me, you deserve to suffer for his sins. I didn't understand what she meant then. I thought she was talking about abandonment, about the pain of being left to raise a child alone. I couldn't have imagined the deeper, more twisted truth that lay beneath her words. She took my bundle of possessions and threw them back into the house. Go inside, she commanded. Clean yourself up. And if you ever try to leave again, I'll tell Arnold myself. And we both know what he'll do to you then. I went back inside, defeated. The coffee can with my savings had mysteriously disappeared. My mother had found it, taken it, destroyed my one chance at escape. That night, when Arnold came home drunk and angry, he seemed to know about my attempted escape without being told. The beating he gave me was the worst yet, and when it was over, he leaned down to whisper in my ear. You're mine, Nellie. You belong to me. And if you ever try to leave again, I'll kill you. Do you understand me? I understood. I understood that I was trapped, that there was no escape, that this was my life now. I was 20 years old, and I felt like I was already dead. But fate, as I would learn, has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. In December of 1971, everything changed. Arnold had been out of work for over a year, living off odd jobs and what little money I could earn taking in washing. We were behind on bills, behind on rent, behind on everything. The house was cold because we couldn't afford fuel, and tempers were shorter than usual. It was on a particularly bitter afternoon that a stranger knocked on our door. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes. He wore a good coat and carried himself with quiet dignity. Good afternoon, he said when Arnold answered the door. I'm looking for Mr. Wilson. I believe you have some property I might be interested in. Arnold's eyes lit up with the prospect of easy money. Come in, come in. I'm Arnold Wilson. What kind of property are you looking for? The man stepped inside, removing his hat politely. I'm Robert, he said. I understand you have a back lot that might be suitable for a small workshop. I looked up from my mending, confused. We didn't have a back lot. Our property was tiny, barely enough for a small garden. But Arnold was already nodding enthusiastically. Yes, yes. Good piece of land. Quiet neighborhood. What kind of workshop were you thinking? Nothing fancy, Robert said. Just a place to work with my hands. I'm recently retired, looking for a project. As they talked, I felt Robert's eyes on me. Not in the way Arnold's friends looked at me with lust or pity, but with something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. This is my wife, Nellie, Arnold said, noticing the direction of Robert's gaze. Nellie, come say hello to Mr. Robert. I stood up, smoothing my dress, acutely aware of the fading bruises on my arms. Pleased to meet you, sir. The pleasure is mine, Mrs. Wilson. His voice was gentle, cultured. I hope I'm not disturbing your evening. Not at all. I said, though, Something about his presence made me uneasy. There was something familiar about him, something that tugged at the edges of my memory. Robert became a regular visitor over the following weeks, always with some excuse about the property, about measurements and surveys and legal documents. Arnold welcomed him eagerly, seeing dollar signs in every conversation. But I noticed that Robert's eyes were usually on me, not on Arnold. And sometimes, when Arnold was out of the room, he would speak to me directly. "How are you, Mrs. Wilson?" he asked one afternoon. "You look tired." "I'm fine," I said automatically. "Just busy with housework." Busy, yes. But I meant, how are you really? His eyes were searching, concerned. "I can see the bruises you try to hide. I know what's happening to you." I felt my face flush with shame. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do. And I want you to know that you don't have to live this way. No one deserves to be treated like that." Before I could respond, Arnold's voice boomed from the kitchen. "Nellie, where's that coffee I asked for?" Robert's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. That night, his words echoed in my mind. Someone had seen my suffering, had acknowledged it, had suggested there might be another way. The next time Robert visited Arnold was at the bar, and my mother was visiting a neighbor. We were alone for the first time since his initial visit. "Mrs. Wilson," he said urgently, "I need to tell you something. Something that's going to change everything you think you know about your life." I looked at him, afraid to hope, afraid to believe that anyone could help me. "There is no backlot," he continued. "There never was. That was just an excuse to get close to you to find a way into this house." "I don't understand. Who are you?" He took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. "My name isn't Robert. It's Joseph Carter. And I'm your father, Nellie." The world stopped. The man standing in my mother's kitchen, the stranger who had been showing me kindness, was the ghost that had haunted my entire life. "That's impossible," I whispered. "You left us. You abandoned us." "No, daughter. I've been searching for you for 20 years. Your mother took you away and hid you from me. She told everyone I'd abandoned you, but it was a lie. I never stopped looking." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My father, my real father, was standing in front of me, and he'd been trying to find me all these years. Why now, I asked, tears streaming down my face. Why did it take so long? "Because your mother was clever. She changed names, moved frequently, told different stories wherever she went. But I finally found a lead. A woman named Debbie who worked at the post office remembered your mother. She told me you'd come to Oak Ridge." "But why the charade? Why not just come to the door?" Joseph's face hardened. "Because I needed to see for myself what was happening to you. I needed to understand the situation before I could help you. And what I've seen..." His voice broke. "What I've seen breaks my heart." We heard the front gate creak. My mother's voice called from the yard, announcing her return. "Tomorrow," Joseph whispered urgently. 3 o'clock, the church square. I'll have a car waiting. It's your only chance, Nellie. Your only way out." He slipped out the back door just as my mother entered the kitchen, her arms full of groceries. "Who was that leaving?" she asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. "Robert," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "He forgot something in his truck." She studied my face for a long moment, and I saw something flicker in her eyes, fear perhaps, or recognition. But she said nothing, just began putting away the groceries with unusual haste. That night, I lay awake planning my escape. I had to be careful, had to make sure neither Arnold nor my mother suspected anything. At 3 o'clock the next day, I would either be free or dead. The morning came gray and threatening, matching the storm in my chest. Arnold was nursing a hangover, snapping at everything I did. My mother watched me constantly, her eyes never leaving my face. "I need to go to the market," I said after lunch, trying to sound casual. "We're almost out of flour." Arnold looked up from his newspaper. "What do you need flour for?" "To make bread. We're almost out." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Don't be gone long. And don't talk to anyone you don't need to." I gathered my coat and purse. my heart pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. Hidden beneath my dress was a small bundle, a change of clothes, the few pieces of jewelry I owned, and a photograph of my grandmother. The walk to the church square felt like walking to my execution. Every step could be my last as a prisoner, or my last as a living woman if I was caught. The church bells were chiming 3 o'clock when I saw the car, a dark sedan, parked beside the old oak tree. Joseph stood beside it, scanning the square anxiously. Our eyes met across the distance, and I saw in his face the same desperate hope I felt in my heart. This was it. My moment of truth. I started walking toward him, each step feeling like a small victory. With every pace, I felt the weight of my past falling away. I was no longer Arnold's victim, no longer my mother's instrument of revenge. I was becoming myself again. Nellie, Joseph said as I approached, his voice thick with emotion. I wasn't sure you'd come. I wasn't sure either, I admitted. But I can't live like this anymore. He opened the car door for me and I slid into the passenger seat. As we drove away from Oak Ridge, I watched the town disappear in the rearview mirror. Somewhere behind us, Arnold would soon discover I was gone. There would be rage, violence, a search. But for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid. Where are we going? I asked. Louisville, Joseph said. I have a house there, a business, a place where you can heal. As we drove through the Kentucky countryside, Joseph told me the real story of my past. How my mother had suffered severe depression after my birth. How she'd become violent and unpredictable. How she'd threatened both him and me during her worst episodes. I tried to get her help. He said, his hands gripping the steering wheel. Doctor's medicine, everything I could think of. But she got worse instead of better. One day she had a complete breakdown. Grabbed a knife, threatened to hurt you. I managed to disarm her, but I was terrified for your safety. So you left? No, I went to get help. Professional help. I thought maybe if she was hospitalized, treated properly, she could get better. But when I came back, you were both gone. She'd packed everything and disappeared. My heart ached for the pain in his voice, for the years of searching for the loss he'd endured. I hired private detectives, he continued. Followed every lead, chased every rumor. But she was always one step ahead. New names, new stories, new lies about why she was alone with a child. And you never stopped looking. Never. Even when the trail went cold, even when people told me to give up, I kept searching. Because you were my daughter, and I loved you, and I knew that somewhere out there you needed me. The sun was setting as we reached Louisville, painting the sky in shades of hope. Joseph's house was modest but welcoming, with a small garden and windows that sparkled in the evening light. This is your home now, he said, helping me out of the car. For as long as you want it to be. Inside the house was warm and comfortable, filled with books and photographs and the lingering scent of fresh bread. Joseph led me to a small bedroom at the back of the house. I prepared this for you, he said softly. I've been hoping for this day for 20 years. I sat on the bed, overwhelmed by the sudden shift from nightmare to dream. In the span of a few hours, I'd gone from being a victim to being a daughter, from being trapped to being free. What happens now, I asked. Now you heal, Joseph said simply. You learn to trust again. You remember who you are. The healing wasn't easy. For months, I jumped at sudden noises, flinched when people moved too quickly, woke up screaming from nightmares. But Joseph was patient, never pushing, never demanding more than I could give. He helped me enroll in night school to finish my education. He taught me to work in his small printing business, showing me how to set type and operate the machines. Slowly, I began to remember what it felt like to be valued, to be treated with respect. You're good at this, he said one afternoon, watching me align a perfect page of text. You have an eye for detail, steady hands. You could run this place someday. It was such a simple compliment, but it meant everything to me. I couldn't remember the last time someone had praised my work, had seen potential in my abilities. As the months passed, I began to venture out into the world again. I made friends with other women at night school, went to church socials, learned to laugh without looking over my shoulder. The frightened girl who'd fled Oak Ridge was slowly being replaced by a woman who was learning to believe in herself again. It was at a church social in the spring of 1975 that I met Michael. He was tall and gentle with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a shy smile that made him seem younger than his 30 years. He ran a small bookstore downtown and had the most wonderful way of talking about books, as if they were dear friends. "Have you read this one?" he asked, showing me a volume of poetry during the social's book exchange. "It's about finding light in darkness." I thought you might appreciate it. Our courtship was nothing like the desperate romance I'd experienced with Arnold. Michael was patient, respectful, never pushing for more than I was ready to give. He seemed to understand that I was still healing, still learning to trust. "I don't know much about your past," he said one evening as we walked through Cherokee Park. "But I can see that someone hurt you badly. I want you to know that I would never do that. I want to help you heal, not add to your pain." We were married in the spring of 1977, with Joseph walking me down the aisle. As I spoke my vows, I felt like I was finally becoming the woman I was meant to be, not a victim, not a prisoner, but a whole person capable of love and joy. Michael and I were blessed with 3 children. Claire was born in 1979, a beautiful baby with Joseph's eyes and Michael's gentle temperament. Gabriel followed in 1982, a curious boy who loved books as much as his father. Marianne, our youngest, arrived in 1985, a spirited girl who reminded me of myself at her age, but without the fear. Watching them grow up in a house filled with love and laughter, I understood how different my life could have been with different choices, different parents. But I also understood that my suffering had given me something precious, the ability to recognize real love when I found it, and the determination to protect it at all costs. Joseph lived to see his grandchildren grow up spoiling them with stories and candy and unconditional love. He taught them about the printing business, about the importance of hard work and honest dealing. He was the father I'd never had, and the grandfather my children deserved. He died peacefully in his sleep in 2000, surrounded by the family he'd fought so hard to find. At his funeral, I spoke about the man who'd never stopped searching, who'd never stopped believing that love could overcome any obstacle. Meanwhile, back in Oak Ridge, the story was reaching its own conclusion. I learned through distant relatives that my mother had stayed with Arnold until his death in 1986. He'd been driving drunk as usual and wrapped his car around a tree on a dark country road. No one else was hurt, and few people mourned his passing. Dorothy lived for 3 more years after that, growing increasingly frail and isolated. She died alone in a nursing home, her last words reportedly being about regret and forgiveness. I felt no joy in her death, no sense of justice served. Only sadness for the woman she might have been if her own pain hadn't consumed her. But there was one last revelation waiting for me, one final piece of the puzzle that would complete my understanding of the past. In 2003, I received a letter from a lawyer in Oak Ridge. Arnold's effects were being disposed of, and among them was a metal box containing documents and photographs. The lawyer thought I might want to see them given my connection to the family. Inside the box, I found correspondence between Arnold and my mother, dating back to 1967, before he'd ever set foot in Henderson's grocery store. The letters revealed a conspiracy that chilled me to the bone. My mother had actively sought out Arnold, had researched his background, had discovered his history of violence against women. She'd approached him with a proposal she would deliver me to him young and vulnerable if he would help her exact revenge on my father through me. "She's his daughter," one letter read. "She has his eyes, his stubborn streak. Make her suffer the way I suffered. Make her pay for what he did to me." Arnold's responses were equally disturbing. He'd agreed to the arrangement, seeing an opportunity to acquire a young wife while satisfying his own twisted desires. The courtship had been planned from the beginning, every kindness calculated to win my trust. The revelation that my mother had essentially sold me to a violent man for the sake of revenge was devastating. but it also brought a strange kind of closure. I finally understood the depth of her hatred, the complete absence of maternal love in her treatment of me. I shared the letters with Michael, who held me while I cried for the girl. I'd been the innocence, I'd lost the mother I'd never really had. "It doesn't change anything," he said softly. "You survived. You escaped. You built a beautiful life despite everything they tried to do to you." He was right. The knowledge of their conspiracy couldn't touch the life I'd built, the love I'd found, the peace I'd made with my past. In 2010, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I returned to Oak Ridge for the first time since my escape nearly 40 years earlier. The town had changed little, but I had changed everything. I stood in the church square, where my father had rescued me, where my real life had begun. I visited the grocery store where I'd met Arnold, now run by the Henderson family's grandchildren. I even drove past the house where I'd suffered, now occupied by a young family who'd painted it cheerful colors and filled the yard with children's toys. The ghosts of my past had no power over me anymore. I was no longer the frightened girl who'd fled in desperation. I was a woman who'd overcome, who'd healed, who'd found her way to happiness despite the cruelest of beginnings. Standing in that square, I whispered a prayer of gratitude for my father's love, for Michael's patience, for my children's laughter, for the strength I'd found in my darkest hours. I thanked God for the rescue that had come when I needed it most, and for the long journey that had led me home to myself. Now, at 76, I sit in my garden in Savannah, watching my grandchildren play in the sunshine. My life didn't turn out the way I'd planned when I was 17 and dreaming of princes and fairy tales. It turned out infinitely better. I learned that real love isn't about being rescued by someone else. It's about finding the courage to rescue yourself and then choosing to share your life with people who honor that courage. I learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who choose to love you, who stand by you when the world turns dark, who help you remember who you are when you've forgotten. I learned that forgiveness isn't about excusing the unforgivable. It's about freeing yourself from the poison of hatred, about refusing to let other people's cruelty define your future. And most importantly, I learned that no matter how broken you feel, no matter how hopeless your situation seems, there's always the possibility of redemption. Always a chance that tomorrow will bring something better than today. The scars from my past are still there on my body and my heart, in the way I sometimes still startle at unexpected sounds. But they're not my whole story. They're not the end of my story. They're just the beginning of a life that refused to be defined by its darkest chapters. A life that chose hope over despair, love over hatred, healing over revenge. Arnold Wilson and Dorothy Carter thought they could destroy me. They thought they could use me as an instrument of their own twisted purposes. But they were wrong. In the end, their cruelty became the very thing that taught me to recognize genuine love when I found it. Their hatred became the backdrop against which my father's devotion shone all the brighter. Their attempt to break me became the foundation of my strength. Justice came for them both, not through my hand, but through the natural consequences of their choices. Arnold died alone, and unmourned, his violence finally catching up with him. Dorothy died with regrets she could never voice, isolated by the hatred she'd nursed for so many years. But I lived. I healed. I loved and was loved in return. I raised children who knew only kindness from their parents. I built a business, a community, a legacy of compassion that will outlast any memory of the pain I once endured. That is the greatest victory of all, not just survival, but transformation. Not just escape, but redemption. Not just healing, but the ability to help others heal. To anyone who might be living in their own Oak Ridge, trapped by their own Arnold or Dorothy, I want you to know there is a way out. There is help waiting even when you can't see it. There is hope even in the darkest hour. Your story doesn't have to end with your pain. Like mine, it can begin with your courage to reach for something better. The taste of blood is no longer familiar. Now I know the taste of freedom, of love, of a life well lived, despite its terrible beginning. And that, my dear ones, is sweeter than any fairy tale ever written.